Hi, everyone. I'm Eshani Surya, and this is Visionary Strangeness, Writing Speculatively. I'm super excited to teach today with Blue Suit because many of you may have known that I was the operations coordinator, I guess like 6 months ago. And so I'm really excited to be back here. I'm also a writer myself, and my book Ravishing is going to be coming out from Roxane Gay Books next year. So, keep an eye out for that if that's something that you are interested in. It is, in fact, speculative fiction, which is what inspired me to do this workshop today. So to get started, I was hoping we could do some introductions. Now, of course, this is a recorded session, so if you don't feel comfortable stating your name or speaking up, feel free to put things in the chat and I can just read them out, and you don't have to have a name associated with it. But I was hoping that some of us might want to chat a little bit about why we like speculative fiction, if you're working on any projects right now, and then this is a little optional, fun getting to know you exercise. Complete this Mad Libs. So the Mad Libs is a blank rebuilds blank out of blank. And so the first one, you would insert a profession, a title, or type of person. So think like scientist or accountant. Rebuilds a place. So like maybe my hometown or Atlantis out of blank something, maybe snails or boxes or bookcases, something like that. So does anybody want to go first? I saw nervous shakes of the head.
Sure.
Awesome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So how do you want to start?
So if you'd like to say your name, feel free. And then you could say why you like speculative fiction or why you decided to join the workshop, if you're working on any projects. And then if you'd like to do the Mad Libs, you can do that. And that's on the screen.
Okay, well, I'm on my phone, so I don't necessarily see that on the screen right now. So my name is Anita, and I live in Oakland, California. I like speculative fiction because I like to read it. I don't write it. I write poetry. And I joined today because it's been a long time. And hey, I got time. I can do it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for being here today. Does anybody else want to introduce themselves?
I could go.
Sure.
I can't see everybody. I'm Jordan Castle. I'm Eshani's biggest fan, self-proclaimed. I like speculative fiction. I too love to read it. I'm here. I'm very excited to explore more what ifs. I feel like so much of my work, especially lately, is centered in the what if and kind of making the weird come out of things. Project I'm working on a kind of spooky novel that is a bit speculative, I suppose. I think everything is speculative, so that's cheating, but yeah, I can do the Mad Lib as well. I wanted to do a magician. There. Yeah, a magician rebuilds sandcastles out of memory.
Ooh, I like that. Sandcastles out of memory. Very nice.
Thank you.
And then we have someone in the chat has just mentioned that they're not a speculative fiction reader or writer, but they love learning different forms that they haven't studied, which is awesome because I think we're going to have all sorts of different levels today in the space. Also, sorry, everyone, my screen is like being really weird. So I'm just going to escape this for a second and then fix it. But does anybody else want to introduce while we're waiting?
I can go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Hillary Steinberg. I'm in Philadelphia. I like speculative fiction because I like, sort of messing up our ideas of baseline normal. I have a book I'm querying that's not getting a lot of steam. That's sort of a take on the immortal boyfriend. So this idea that like everyone lives the same life over and over, but only the boyfriend remembers the past lives. I'm working on one now about a woman who can see past and future versions of herself. And for my Mad Lib, I'll say a mermaid rebuilds Atlantis out of trash.
First of all, your book sounds fantastic.
I hope so. I like it.
Yeah, it gets some traction soon. And also, I love that Mad Lib. So thank you so much. Would anyone else like to introduce?
Hi, my name is, I don't have my camera on.
All good. You can keep it, you can turn it on or you don't have to.
Okay, hi. My name is Ayasha Ayurbi. I like speculative fiction because it's kind of like the world of wonder. I wonder if. So I am working on a short story collection of just, I guess it's like the roles of women in alternate universes. And then I would say, because, okay, so I'm partially an educator. I'm sorry, I'm like half remote today. So I'm going to say an educator rebuilds confidence out of systemic oppression.
Ooh, wow, I really like that. That is really cool because I feel like it's really undermining what we believe around oppression. So that's really exciting. Love that. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Anyone else? All right. So if anybody feels like introducing in the chat, feel free to do so. Laura is a reader and a dabbler of speculative fiction, loving the weird of working on a piece about monstrous female and hunger. Love that. Always love hungry girls. And then a few people have mentioned that since COVID, they've had more time to work. So excited to see what's here. Well, I hope that you enjoy it. So let's move forward then. Keep introducing yourselves in the chat if you would like to. So I wanted to start a little bit with what speculative fiction is. And I feel that this is honestly a very difficult thing to define because there's so many ways in which it's been defined like through life. I was doing a little bit of reading on it, and I believe it was first kind of coined in the 70s or maybe the 80s. But since then, I personally feel like it's grown a lot in the last decade. People have been really excited about speculative fiction. So I wanted to first pull this this quote from Clarion West. If you're not familiar with Clarion West, they do amazing workshops every year, specifically around sci-fi and speculative fiction. So I felt like, they were leaders in the field, like a good place to start our discussion. So they say that speculative fiction invites readers to imagine possibilities that challenge and expand their understanding of the world, which is, I think, a really great definition. I also feel like a lot of fiction does that. That isn't necessarily just speculative. So I think what to me is exciting about that definition is the idea of imagining possibilities. And a couple of you said this in your introductions. You said that you were excited about playing with what if today. And I think for me, that is actually like the really big definition of speculative fiction is kind of thinking, okay, what if this crazy thing happened? And then realizing that you actually could make a really meaningful story out of that. And that's my sort of shorthand definition of it. I would say that it is open to many subgenres, and I've been personally very excited by the ways in which it's been growing into alternate histories as well. So we're seeing a lot of like maybe harder sci-fi kind of join in with this. We're seeing like superhero books. We see alternate histories, as I mentioned. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of like that fantasy creep as well. So I really think that there's a lot that can be done. And I think sometimes for me, what I feel speculative fiction is like my child brain. Like when I would go around and live in the world and think like, so my favorite thing to say is that like for maybe 5 years when I was a child, I thought that all hills were dinosaur bodies that hadn't been excavated yet. And I grew up in Connecticut, so you would imagine that all the dinosaurs had been excavated by that point. But like that childlike brain and imagination, I think, can really be the opening into speculative fiction. And then I also think about it as high concept. So this is often a publishing term where you can pitch the plot of something in a sentence. So I'll give you an example from my book. My book is a brother and a sister get caught up in a beauty tech company whose makeup has the power to physically change faces. And that's like something that I can say in an elevator pitch when I'm with people. But at the same time, the book is really invested in strangeness, in characterizations, in emotional resonances, and does have an emphasis on language. And for me, that's where we're kind of in the speculative realm versus the very hard genre sci-fi realm. But again, genre, very, very difficult to get your hands on. I don't really totally believe in genre. I think there's others in this room, I would guess, don't believe in genre, knowing their work. So, it's very broad definition. If anybody wants to chime in at this point to talk a little bit about how they've thought about speculative fiction, please feel free. And you can use the chat or you can unmute.
I guess I'm just wondering what's the difference between speculative fiction and like dystopian writing, or if it falls under the same umbrella.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of people I think will put it under the same umbrella. I feel, and like, this is me, which is that it's more of a publishing definition. So if you're going to say that you're doing dystopian, then you're really specifically saying like, I'm working in a very particular genre and there's going to be expectations, conventional expectations that people are going to see of this dystopian. And they might compare you to like the Hunger Games, for example, very quickly. I also think that often they'll compare you to YA. I feel like speculative, it's more of this like adult terminology. But technically, I think there's a lot of dystopias that are in speculative. And Severance by Ling Ma comes to mind for me very quickly. So that was a great question. Anyone else have thoughts or questions or anything resonating with them so far?
Is there, I assume there's not a hard line between magical realism and speculative? Is it like a Venn diagram?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a Venn diagram. I think one of the other things that comes up with magical realism is it does have a lot of roots in Latinx literature. And so I think that there can be a question of like, in what ways are we appropriating or not appropriating when we use magical realism? So that's why I tend to call myself speculative, because I don't have that cultural or background or heritage. But I think there are a lot of similarities. I'm not a Latinx literature scholar, so I feel that there's probably other resources on the internet that could speak a little bit more towards how what's happening in magical realism is also like relating to what's important in cultural values as well. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Okay, so let's get writing, because I think that's the fun thing about Thursdays on the Steep. It's a really great 1 hour time for us to get writing. So what I want to do for us is create something in 10 minutes that you can kind of use throughout this session. And these are prompts that I actually got from this Twitter bot. And you'll notice it does say magical realism bot. So it's a really good question about like where that line is. And this bot has called themselves that. And I do follow this on Twitter and I really love it. And I think there's just like fun, weird ideas that come out of it that like are potentially places to start writing. So I picked 8 today that I just thought were fun and interesting. And I thought that you guys could use them as starting points for a 10-minute writing session. I also wanted you to feel free to play with them. So for example, the first one is at the stroke of midnight, a giant tiger rises from the Mediterranean Sea. If you want to make it a giant squid or a giant rocket rises from the Mediterranean Sea, feel free, whatever kind of like gets you excited. But that's the first one. The second one is an army major owns a piece of rose quartz, which allows her to make an infinite quantity of dictionaries, which I thought was very interesting with war, dictionaries, language. I think there's some stuff there. Prince owns an ice sculpture, which depicts every humiliating defeat that has ever happened. And I'm sure many of us have had humiliating defeats in our lives that we can pull from here. Number 4 is there's a library in Barcelona where you can borrow opium poppies instead of books. 5 is there's a storm in Tokyo. It rains knives. 6 is there's a gay sauna in Budapest. Everyone who goes there is a shooting star. 7, in Mumbai, there's a carnation that is the color of the future. And 8, you receive the memories of Werner Herzog, which I feel like is very specific, but feel free to change that one to anyone else if you want to make it Beyonce, Taylor Swift, your mom, whatever you want to do. So we're just going to take 10 minutes to use one of these prompts and write, and I'll go back to the page. Kind of said this wrong. I said it was on the next page, but it's on the page before. And then we will do some sharing, and then we'll kind of move forward with these. Does anybody have any questions before I put the 10 minutes on the clock? Okay, go ahead and get started, everyone. And we are at the 30-second mark. So start finishing up those thoughts and come back into our shared space. So I know that it's a lot to, sit down, do a 10-minute prompt and start sharing. But I am hoping that some of us might want to at least speak about our pieces. And if you would like to share or read aloud, you can as well. And then I wanted to give some guidelines for how to listen and what kind of feedback to provide in order to be useful going forward in the session. So if you are someone who is listening to someone share, please share one thing you loved, maybe in the chat or out loud. And then maybe one question you now have about like the situation, the world, or the characters. So something that you feel like the writer could move forward in. So again, if you want to share, you can unmute and you can share the actual piece, or you could just share some of like what you did. You can also put it in the chat and I can read it out loud for you. And Taylor, maybe we could stop recording at this point. Would that be possible? And there will be more opportunities to share as well. So I pulled this little section of an essay by Karen Russell. I love Karen Russell's work, and I definitely encourage you to reach or to check her out if you haven't. And she has this essay in Tin House called "Engineering Impossible Architectures." And she uses this fantastic Kansas-Oz dichotomy. So I'm just going to read this to you. One lesson that I have to relearn continually is that writing fiction set in an alternate reality, and let me just sidebar, I think alternate reality is also a very nice way to think about speculative fiction, so that it's close to what we are experiencing, but it's also a little bit different. That's another definition you could use. So writing fiction set in an alternate reality doesn't mean you get a free pass to do any crazy thing you want. If you're going to try a Kansas-Oz shuffle, a radical rearrangement of nature, you have some additional responsibilities to the reader, namely that you don't get tripped out on your godlike power, or more likely just exhausted and forgetful, and violate the parameters of the world that you've created. Many of my early stories failed to create a consistent rule-governed world, an Oz of sturdy emerald construction. They took place in frictionless worlds where I myself felt like a tourist with only a shallow sense of the laws and customs, places where anything was possible and there was no discernible center of gravity. I kept changing the rules as I was going, so the stakes were non-existent. It was a world that wasn't governed, that wasn't consistent, so nothing was at stake. It wasn't a world of consequences, so readers didn't care what happened. And so I think this advice has kind of come out of sci-fi and fantasy writers before, like, what is the government that your fantasy world exists in? Or like, what are the cultural norms? And I think it's really important here that Karen Russell talks a little bit about consequences and stakes. So when you're writing like very realistic fiction, you kind of know if somebody goes and steals bread, Jean Valjean, that there's going to be this consequence that like you're not supposed to do that in this world, and thus that sets off the entire story of Javert the policeman going after him for many years. If you don't set up those kinds of laws and customs in your new fiction and your speculative fiction, you're not necessarily going to have readers understanding what something means when it actually happens. I would also additionally say that your world becomes less interesting. I don't know if any of you have ever read books like this, but I have read books where the conceit is really exciting. So that initial one-line pitch is super great. And then the story doesn't know where to go from there. And my argument is that when you create a more full world, the pitch, that one-line log line, is actually not even as important as the world that you're exploring and being part of. And as a reader, you have a lot to sift through. And obviously that's like very true of a novel, but I think even in a short story or even in a flash fiction, the initial idea might be exciting to people, but they want to hear something more. They want to understand why that matters. And so that's going to be our next prompt right now is, what are the rules of the world that you created? So how do the speculative elements of the world affect maybe the political landscape? Is there war? Is there diplomacy going on? Economic landscape? Does this tiger take away jobs somehow? What about money, housing, climate? And obviously many of us on the East Coast really experiencing that in this moment. So thinking about climate change, our relationship to nature, social structures, gender roles, class delineations, family hierarchies, and then religion. We got a really good example of that in our first piece, where we saw that our religion was created by this flower. Will there be a religion around the tiger? Perhaps. Will there be an anti-tiger religion? Perhaps. Also, romantic norms can be interesting. And so I'm going to ask you to take 10 minutes and to take one of these different ideas of rules and write a scene about it. The scene should exist in the same world or concept of your first exercise, but I think it will be helpful to you to write something completely different, not necessarily revise what you originally wrote. That being said, if you feel like you could revise what you originally wrote with more of an eye towards one of these different rules, that could also be an option for you. Does anyone have any questions before I put time on the clock? And I'm actually only going to do like 5 or 6 minutes this time, just so that we have time. But any questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question. Is there like a name for something that is like light speculative when it's our world with just like a slightly different thing? Or is it still just speculative generally?
So I personally would probably call that speculative or slipstream. But I think that there might be something like alternate reality could also fall for that. Is there a particular reason that you feel like, is that like maybe something you want to look into more deeply?
I think that my other stuff has sort of done that. So I didn't know how to categorize it, but maybe it doesn't need categorizing. That's
Love that you said that. But I would say that if I was looking for like journals to submit to, or like a way to talk to an agent about it or something, I would probably call it speculative or slipstream, would be my go-to. Fabulous, Jordan. I think it's possible that it could be fabulous. I've like personally also heard of fabulous as maybe more around fable, but
Right.
but I think again, fable can grow and become a lot of different things as well.
Could you,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you explain what it is you want us to do again? I'm a little confused.
Oh,
Sorry.
sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So I'd like you to take that first exercise that you did and think about the world that you created in that exercise. And then I want you to add some rules to it. So I want you to think about, what is the political landscape of the world, or what are people's
okay.
relationship to nature, or something like that. And then go ahead and write a second scene that has to do in that world. Does that make a little more sense?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and put time on the clock. And if there's more questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat.
Rules.
And let's start bringing ourselves back into the space, finishing up what you're working on. So I got a message from someone who was like, this is a lot to think about in 5 minutes, which it absolutely is. You're 100% right. First of all, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone who might be interested in it or needs it. But second of all, yeah, there's no pressure to have finished anything here. It's more of a thinking exercise. And I hope that it is helpful in that way for you as well. So we can do a little bit of sharing for a few minutes if anybody would like to. And the idea was that the listeners would share an emotion that this evokes for us, because our next step is going to be about emotions. We're probably not going to have time for the next step, unfortunately, but I'm going to walk you through it as well. But for this moment, would anyone like to share anything that they either wrote or just maybe something that you came up with? So maybe you're like, hey, I was working with prompt number 4, which was this, and I started thinking about this type of like political economy for my world or anything like that.
Mine, I can do mine really quickly, actually, my
Yeah.
little scene. So I had
Please
worked
do.
with the ice sculpture prompt, and I changed it. So it started out, a girl inherits an ice sculpture, which depicts every hopeful thing that has ever happened. And so I was dealing with like the rules of the world, and I loved that last set of rules, but I got stuck on just the idea of rules in general. So I wrote, the rules of the world are simple. Do not let the ice sculpture melt. That's only one rule, and there is only one girl to follow it. And then I talk about her visits to the frozen room to check on the ice sculpture to make sure it doesn't melt, and what will happen if it does melt.
Ooh, I really like that, first of all, because it feels like it's like a small rule for one person. So then kind of the tension of like, she has this rule, but other people around her maybe don't have that rule. I feel like that's a really interesting place. And emotionally, like I got like little shivers. I guess that's not really an emotion, but I was like anticipation, like what's going to happen, because like this is going to melt, I think. So that was what I was feeling. And then Gina said, I love this concept and the idea / fear of the ice sculpture melting. So like, yeah, a little bit of that fear coming in as well. Does anybody else want to share anything that they worked on or thought about?
I could share something.
Yeah, please do.
I didn't get too far in writing this time, but I also chose the giant tiger prompt. And I'd be curious to hear about people's experiences with this. So I kind of ended up writing that this is a world where each individual like object or component cluster kind of exists independently as a sentient entity, from like the entire universe as a whole down to like the tiger, to the tiger's paw, to, you know, a microbe in the tiger's stomach, to a single atom, and these kind of nested overlapping like beings. And sometimes they overline, or sorry, their interests like align, but sometimes they don't. And I feel like I got to thinking about this because I was kind of struggling with the rules bit, especially because I know the prompts were all like very weird, speculative, like they were all a little bit surrealist or slipstream, or right, not coming from the culture of magical realism, but from that kind of slight shifting, unexplained shifting of reality feeling of it. And it kind of got me thinking about the way that essay, like how that applies to worlds where kind of the rules that we know are intentionally broken or intentionally are kind of made to not make sense, or are softer. And so I was kind of curious as to what your guys' experiences are, because it still has to have some sort of internal consistency. It still has to make sense, but how that functions differently in a world where the rules are kind of intentionally blurry or softer or smeared.
Yeah, and also maybe to add to that, like the way that I thought about rules was very human in certain ways, right? Like, okay, so there are human societies, human politics, human economies, but in the way that you've described it, which is really interesting, is that these are the rules of something that we also like don't know how to think about, because we don't necessarily know the experience of a cell. And so then there's this almost like anthropomorphizing of it if you do the prompt the way that I wrote it, which is like oh, the cells must have like capitalism, but like they may not, right? And so that is like really fascinating because I feel like it makes you have to think very differently. And I guess what I'm wondering, and I would love people's thoughts about this, is like, is that possible? Are we able to look at this from like a non-human perspective, or is that anthropomorphizing like fundamental to what we do? And then it's just like humans are completely centered in everything we do. Wow, that was a big thought, big question. The environmental scientist instantly went for the biological rules instead of the cultural ones. Yeah, and I mean, I think like that's really that's a possibility of like where you could also go for rules, is like the things that we can observe in nature that are still sort of like human defined, because science is like human defined, but at the same time it's observable as something outside of ourselves. It's like why we're so interested in like bird behaviors, because they behave differently than we behave. Does anyone have any thoughts on that or anything else in this realm?
I actually, really quickly with that, it makes me think, I feel bad, I have not read the trilogy, but the movie Annihilation, there's a lot, of course, about the physicality of the plants and doing things they're not meant to be doing and how they work within their own system of rules and how they are like and not like humans. And I just thought of that. That's a good stretch.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I haven't read it either, but definitely something maybe to look at and think about. How rules can operate. I think too, like maybe when we think about rules, we can think about how the world is organized. Feels like a little bit softer than thinking about rules, and maybe that's helpful because you were mentioning some of the like the softness or the blurriness of rules. Like, yeah, because I mean, maybe you're writing a world that's completely chaotic and like literally there is no organization, and that like might be very interesting to just completely push back on the idea of organization. But I think many of us are probably writing worlds in which there is some type of organization, or people, creatures, even inanimate objects like behave in a certain way to make the world stay underpinned. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at with the rules idea as well. So we have like maybe 5 minutes left because of course I'm not very good at my time management. But I want to read you guys this after we get. So it turns out Keynote is like does not like Zoom is like basically what I learned. So but anyway, I wanted to read you all this bit of an essay from LitHub on finding the strangeness in the mundane and vice versa. So it's a really interesting essay actually, where she talks about how she went out to like write this very speculative piece, but then she actually discovered that like the weirdness was in writing about Long Island, which I thought was really great. And so I just generally would recommend reading this essay, but this part I feel is maybe more salient to what we're doing here. So she says, when I set out to write my novel, The Nobodies, I had a sense of the parameters that would contain its fantastical presence. By simply touching their foreheads together, the two main characters, Nina and Jess, can switch bodies. No one else in this book would have this ability. So we're seeing like a rule here, right? And I wanted their superpower to be held inside a closed system. So that is kind of like the pitch that I was talking about before. Like we understand like really quickly, two main characters can switch bodies by touching their foreheads together. And then we also know that there's maybe some rules to this world where it's like nobody else can do this, although not quite the rules I was talking about, but a version of that. But then this part is what really got me. I was exploring the intensely cloistered nature of the bond that can form between girlfriends. So this body swapping would occur in an otherwise ordinary or realistic world, but what would that look like? And then later, as she's writing the essay, she says, there's actually so much that's bizarre and even horrifying in the idea of switching bodies with another person and leaving yourself behind and walking around in someone else's skin. And there are these scary existential questions this power raised for me about notions of a fixed self, of containing any permanence or coherence, and of the ethics of entering the inner sanctum of another. And I was like, whoa, this is like way more than just switching bodies, right? Like switching bodies is like a cool Hollywood thing, like whatever. But this is taking this into another direction where you finish reading this book and ideally you're not really left wondering about the body switching as much as you are about like what that means in terms of our human experience. And again, this is like a very personal relationship to speculative writing, but for me, that is very important about speculative writing because I want people to leave my work thinking about how their own reality exists and is shaped. And I think that a lot of people who write literary or thoughtful work in a particular way might be thinking about that as well. So had we had time, I would have had us do some finding of themes in our work. And the way that I would have had us do this, and again, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint if it is helpful to anybody, but it would be considering your main character. And the reason for that is because I think that it's often easier to explore themes through the lens of a particular perspective. And then you might have multiple perspectives at some point, or you might have a narrator that's at odds with the main character's perspective. But if you're just starting out, this is sometimes like a good way just to like figure out what your themes are. And so I was going to have you write a first person scene where they either engage neutrally or positively with the speculative element, and you focus on their feelings and what are they feeling as they're engaging with that speculative element. Or they were going to fight back against the speculative element. Why are they fighting against it? What do they not like about it? What makes them uncomfortable? And then I was going to maybe have you watch someone that this main character loves or hates engage with the speculative element. So how would that affect their relationship, and why would it affect their relationship in that way? And I think that when you think about a character interacting with something, and then figuring out what makes them feel uncomfortable or excited or hopeful, that's when you can start to get at the ideas that are maybe actually bubbling up inside you when you think about the speculative element. What makes you engage with that speculative element as a writer, and what's the theme that you're trying to get to? And then I was also going to say that if your original scene already did something like this, you could also consider timeline of a story. So could you write a scene that takes place 3 days later, a week later, a year later, and how has the world then affected your main character? Because I think that can be a way to think about it too. In my book, we have a main character that engages with the makeup, but as time goes on, her relationship with the makeup changes. And so in that change, there might be a theme that could be explored. So as I said, we don't have time for that, but does anyone have any questions in this moment about that?
You were great. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. So I did also want to just put out a few speculative books that I love, just because I think that's a question that often comes up. So School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan, who actually was a Philly author at some point, Swaplandia by Karen Russell, who I love, Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, and Severance by Ling Ma. If you have any recommendations that you want to throw in the chat, like please feel free. And also, if you do want to stay in touch with me, I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also on TikTok. You can see my blushy face. I really don't use it very much, but if you're a TikTok user, feel free to connect that way. And then I have a Substack and I have an email as well. And then wonderful recommendations are coming through in the chat, but I don't want to hold you all much later than 5 o'clock because I know everyone's busy right now, but I just want to say thank you to you all for being here and for participating.